The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room, watching my former boss, Marcus Wellington, adjust his silk tie for the third time. His manicured fingers drummed against the polished table, and I could see the nervous perspiration forming at his temples, despite the aggressive air conditioning. 27 floors below us, downtown Seattle bustled with the usual Monday morning chaos, but up here in the executive suite of Wellington Tech Solutions, the only sound was the quiet tick of an antique clock and Marcus's increasingly labored breathing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I smoothed my charcoal business suit and allowed myself a small smile as I watched him squirm. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was sitting in the same chair where, 18 months ago, he had delivered what he thought would be the final blow to my career. The same chair where he had looked at me with those cold gray eyes and said the words that still echoed in my mind like shrapnel. Today, those same eyes couldn't quite meet mine, as he realized the tables had turned in ways his MBA from Harvard never prepared him for. The conference room door opened with a soft whisper, and Sarah Chen, the company's head of human resources, entered carrying a leather portfolio. She had been present during my termination, sitting silent as Marcus destroyed my reputation with calculated precision. Now she avoided eye contact entirely, her usual confidence replaced by the careful movements of someone walking on thin ice. Behind her came David Morrison, the company's chief financial officer, whose smug expression during my firing had burned itself into my memory like a brand. Marcus cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the silence. He was a man accustomed to controlling narratives, to shaping stories that painted him as the visionary leader who made tough decisions for the greater good. At 45, he had built Wellington Tech Solutions from a small startup into a mid-sized software company, and his corner office was filled with awards and photographs of him shaking hands with politicians and tech luminaries. His success had bred the kind of arrogance that mistakes cruelty for strength. The morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows cast long shadows across the conference table, and I found myself thinking about another kind of light, the harsh desert sun of Afghanistan that had taught me the difference between real leadership and the performative kind that thrived in corporate boardrooms. Marcus had never learned that distinction. To him, power was about dominance, about making others feel small so he could feel large. I opened the manila folder in front of me and pulled out a single sheet of paper, placing it face down on the table between us. The gesture was deliberate, theatrical even. But after what I had endured in this very room, a little drama felt appropriate. Marcus's eyes fixed on the paper as if it might explode, which, in a way, it would. Sarah shifted in her seat, her pen hovering over her notepad. She had always been efficient, the kind of HR executive who could make terminations feel clinical and impersonal. During my firing, she had recited company policies like scripture, never once acknowledging that the woman sitting across from her had spent 3 tours in Afghanistan before dedicating 4 years to this company. To Sarah, I had been just another personnel issue to be resolved cleanly. The silence stretched until Marcus finally found his voice. It came out smaller than his usual commanding baritone, cracked around the edges like old leather. He had aged in the 18 months since I last sat in this room, his perfectly styled brown hair now showing threads of gray, his jaw less defined. Success had been kind to him until recently, but I knew from my research that the company had been struggling, losing key contracts and bleeding talent. I let my gaze drift around the room, taking in the familiar details that had once felt like home. The abstract paintings that Marcus had commissioned from local artists, claiming to support the community while paying them a fraction of what their work was worth. The bookshelf lined with business strategy guides and biographies of tech moguls, books that taught manipulation but never wisdom. The view of Elliott Bay that had once inspired me during late nights spent debugging code and building solutions that made this company profitable. This room had been the site of many meetings over my 4 years with Wellington Tech Solutions, strategy sessions where I had proposed the innovations that became our most successful products, performance reviews where Marcus had praised my technical skills while somehow making it clear that I would never quite fit into his vision of corporate culture, team meetings where my ideas were dismissed until a male colleague repeated them 5 minutes later to enthusiastic approval. I had learned to navigate those dynamics with the same patience I had used to survive rocket attacks in Kandahar. You adapt, you endure, you find ways to accomplish the mission despite obstacles that seem designed to break your spirit. Corporate politics were just another form of asymmetric warfare, and I had been trained by the best to handle hostile environments. Marcus reached for his coffee mug, a massive ceramic thing emblazoned with the company logo, but his hand trembled slightly and he pulled it back. The man who had once fired me for what he called unpredictable emotional outbursts and, quote, concerning behavioral patterns, was now struggling to maintain his composure. The irony was delicious. Sarah cleared her throat softly. "Perhaps we should begin," she suggested, her voice carefully neutral. She had perfected the art of corporate diplomacy, saying everything and nothing simultaneously. During my termination, she had used that same tone to explain why my military service, which should have been an asset, was being reframed as a liability. I nodded slowly, savoring the moment. The paper between us seemed to pulse with potential energy, like an unexploded ordnance waiting for the right pressure to detonate. Marcus's corporate empire, built on his reputation as a decisive leader who made tough choices, was about to discover what tough choices really looked like. The morning sun climbed higher, and the shadows in the room shifted. Somewhere in the building below us, employees were settling into their workstations, checking emails, grabbing coffee from the break room. They had no idea that the company they worked for was about to change hands, that the woman their former CEO had publicly humiliated was now holding the keys to their future. I thought about those employees, many of whom I had worked alongside for years. Good people who deserved better leadership than Marcus could provide. Engineers who had watched me get escorted out by security 18 months ago, their faces a mixture of shock and fear as they realized that if it could happen to me, it could happen to anyone. They deserved to know that loyalty and competence mattered more than playing political games. Marcus finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want, Jessica?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. What did I want? Justice felt too simple, too clean for what had transpired. Revenge implied emotion, and this was far more calculated than that. I wanted accountability. I wanted the truth to matter. I wanted the narrative to finally reflect reality, instead of the convenient fiction that powerful men told themselves about the women they discarded. I flipped the paper over with a single finger, revealing the letterhead of Morrison, Blake & Associates, one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms. The document was brief, clinical in its language, but devastating in its implications. It was a notification of change in ownership, effective immediately. Wellington Tech Solutions no longer belonged to Marcus Wellington. It belonged to me. Marcus's face went through a fascinating series of transformations as he read. Confusion gave.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Way to disbelief. Disbelief to horror. Horror to a kind of desperate rage that reminded me of wounded animals I had seen in the desert. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his carefully constructed corporate persona crumbling like sandcastles at high tide. Sarah's pen clattered to the table. David Morrison, who had been silent until now, made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a groan. The three of them stared at the document as if looking might change its contents, as if will alone could alter the reality that had just shattered their understanding of how the world worked. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking softly. The sound reminded me of my grandfather's old recliner, where he used to tell me stories about serving in Vietnam, about coming home to a country that didn't understand what he had seen or done. He had taught me that sometimes justice takes time, that patience was a warrior's greatest weapon. Marcus found his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. "This is impossible. This company isn't for sale. I never agreed to any acquisition." I smiled then, the first genuine expression of joy I had allowed myself since entering this room. "You're absolutely right, Marcus. The company wasn't for sale, but when you defaulted on the loans you took to expand the server infrastructure, when you missed 3 consecutive payments to Meridian Capital Group, you created an opportunity. I simply bought your debt." The words landed like precision strikes. Marcus's face went white as he processed the implications. Sarah was frantically flipping through her portfolio, searching for documents that might contradict what I was telling them. David Morrison looked like he might be sick. I continued, my voice steady and calm. Meridian was very happy to sell your debt to Tech Vanguard Holdings for 75 cents on the dollar. They were facing a significant loss on their investment in you, Marcus. Bad leadership tends to be expensive. Tech Vanguard Holdings was my company, a shell corporation I had established 6 months ago, with the help of some very talented lawyers and financial advisors. It had taken time to put all the pieces in place, to wait for Marcus's mismanagement to create the opening I needed. Patience learned in the mountains of Afghanistan had served me well in the boardrooms of Seattle. Marcus's hands were shaking now, his usual commanding presence reduced to barely controlled panic. You can't do this. There are procedures, regulations, board approvals required. I pulled another document from my folder, this one bearing the seal of the Washington State Department of Commerce. All properly filed and approved. Tech Vanguard Holdings is now the majority owner of Wellington Tech Solutions. As CEO of Tech Vanguard, I'm exercising my right to make immediate operational changes. The silence that followed was profound. 27 floors below, Seattle continued its daily rhythm. But in this conference room, time seemed suspended. 3 people who had once held my career in their hands were discovering what powerlessness felt like. Sarah finally found her voice. Jessica, perhaps we can discuss this. There might be room for negotiation, for finding a solution that works for everyone. I turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time since entering the room. Sarah Chen had been with the company for 8 years, climbing the corporate ladder with careful precision. She had a reputation for being fair but firm, for handling difficult personnel situations with professional detachment. But 18 months ago, she had sat in this same chair and watched Marcus destroy my reputation without saying a word. "Do you remember what you told me during my termination, Sarah?" I asked, my voice conversational. "You said that the company had to consider the safety and comfort of all employees. You said that my episodes created an unsafe work environment." Sarah's composure cracked slightly. "Jessica, you have to understand the position we were in. There were reports, concerns about your behavior." I nodded slowly. "Concerns about my behavior? Let me refresh your memory about those episodes you referenced." The first occurred during a team meeting when I noticed that David Morrison's hand was trembling and he was sweating profusely. Instead of ignoring it, I quietly asked if he was okay and suggested he step outside for some air. It turned out he was having a panic attack. Jake later thanked me for recognizing the signs and helping him before it became a medical emergency. David Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Jake was his nephew, a detail that had somehow been omitted from the reports about my concerning behavior. "The second episode," I continued, "happened when I heard what sounded like a car backfiring in the parking garage. My training kicked in, and I hit the deck, pulling 2 coworkers down with me. It turned out to be a delivery truck with a faulty exhaust, but my reaction came from 3 tours in Afghanistan, where sounds like that usually meant incoming mortars. Those coworkers wrote statements supporting me, explaining that they understood why I reacted that way." Marcus was staring at the table now, unable to meet my eyes. He knew the truth of what had happened, how my military experience had been weaponized against me, turned from an asset into a liability, through careful manipulation of facts. "The third and final episode," I said, my voice hardening slightly, "occurred when I walked into the break room and found Sandra Williams crying at a table. She had just received news that her son had been injured in a training accident at Fort Lewis. I sat with her, helped her make phone calls to the base, and used my military contacts to get accurate information about his condition. For that, I was written up for abandoning my workstation during business hours." Sarah's face had gone pale. The official reports had painted these incidents as evidence of emotional instability, of a veteran who couldn't adapt to civilian life. The reality was far different, but reality had been inconvenient for the narrative Marcus wanted to construct. I stood up slowly, letting the movement draw their attention. At 5'6", I wasn't physically imposing, but 4 years in the Army had taught me how to project authority without raising my voice. Marcus, who had once towered over me psychologically, now seemed to shrink in his chair. "The truth is, Marcus, you needed a scapegoat. The Henderson contract was failing because of your poor project management, not because of anything I did or didn't do. But it was easier to blame the veteran with PTSD than to accept responsibility for your own failures. Marcus finally looked up, and I saw something desperate in his eyes. Jessica, you're right. I made mistakes. But destroying the company won't solve anything. Think about the employees, about their families. They don't deserve to suffer because of what happened between us. It was a predictable move, trying to make me the villain for taking action against his incompetence. But I had anticipated this response, had prepared for the moment when he would try to paint himself as the protector of innocent workers. You're absolutely right, I said, and I saw a flicker of hope cross his face. The employees don't deserve to suffer. That's why I'm not destroying the company. I'm saving it. I pulled out a third document, this one thick, with detailed financial projections and strategic plans. Wellington Tech Solutions has been hemorrhaging money for 2 years. You've lost 3 major clients, your employee turnover rate is at 38%, and your reputation in the industry is circling the drain. Under new management, this company can not only survive, but thrive. David Morrison leaned forward, his accounting background making him naturally curious about the numbers. What kind of changes are you planning? I smiled at him, remembering how he had smirked during my termination as if watching a particularly entertaining movie. The first change is immediate. Marcus Wellington, you're terminated. Effective now. Security will escort you from the building, and your access to all company systems has been revoked. The words hit, fluctuating like a physical blow. Marcus actually recoiled, his chair rolling back from the table. You can't do this. I built this company. My name is on the building. Actually, the building is leased, and the lease allows for signage changes with 30 days notice. We'll be rebranding as Vanguard Solutions within the month. I turned to Sarah. Miss Chen, you have a choice. You can stay and help rebuild this company's culture into something that actually values all employees. Or you can follow Marcus out the door. The decision is yours. Sarah's mind was clearly racing, weighing her options. She was smart enough to recognize that her association with my termination had damaged her position, but experienced enough to know that good HR executives were always in demand. What would staying entail? She asked carefully. A complete review of all personnel policies, starting with our approach to mental health and veteran affairs. You would work with me to create an environment where military experience is valued, where PTSD is treated as a medical condition rather than a character flaw, and where employee well-being is more than just a line item in the company handbook. I could see her processing this, recognizing both the challenge and the opportunity. Sarah was ambitious, and a successful transformation of the company's culture would be a significant feather in her cap. Marcus tried one last desperate gambit. The board will never approve this. They know me, they trust me. They won't just hand over control to someone who was fired for mental instability. I laughed then, a genuine sound of amusement that seemed to confuse him. Marcus, you really haven't been paying attention to your own company's financial situation. The board doesn't have a choice. When I acquired your debt, I also acquired the right to call it due immediately. The company owes Meridian Capital Group $4.2 million. Since Tech Vanguard now holds that debt, Wellington Tech Solutions owes that money to me. The implications hit him like a freight train. His face went through another series of transformations as he realized the scope of what I had accomplished. This wasn't just a hostile takeover. It was a complete reversal of fortune engineered with military precision. The board meeting to formalize the transition is scheduled for this afternoon. I continued. Your resignation letter is already prepared. You can sign it voluntarily, or I can call the loan and force the company into bankruptcy. Either way, your tenure here is over. David Morrison spoke up, his voice shaky. What about the rest of us? Are we all being terminated? I turned to him, studying his face. David had been complicit in my firing, had provided the financial justification for reducing headcount by eliminating, quote, problematic employees. But he was also a competent accountant, and the company would need financial stability during the transition. That depends, David. Are you willing to work for a company that operates with integrity? One that doesn't scapegoat employees to cover for management failures? He nodded quickly, perhaps too quickly. Absolutely. I want what's best for the company. Good. Your first assignment will be conducting a complete audit of all financial decisions made over the past 2 years. I want to know where every dollar went, and I want recommendations for improving our fiscal responsibility. Marcus was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. The woman he had dismissed as unstable, as a liability to be discarded, had just orchestrated the most sophisticated corporate acquisition he had ever witnessed. The cognitive dissonance was clearly overwhelming. How? He whispered. How did you plan all this? I sat back down, crossing my legs and folding my hands in my lap. You made a fundamental error, Marcus. You assumed that because I had PTSD, I was weak. You confused trauma with incompetence, struggle with failure. But the military taught me something you never learned in business school: how to turn disadvantages into advantages. I paused, letting that sink in. After you fired me, I had 2 choices. I could accept your narrative and disappear quietly, or I could use everything you taught me about corporate warfare to outmaneuver you. I chose the latter. The morning sun had climbed higher, and the conference room was now flooded with bright light. It felt symbolic somehow, illuminating truths that had been hidden in shadow for too long. Marcus squinted against the glare, his carefully constructed image finally stripped away to reveal the mediocre executive underneath. For 18 months, I studied this company like a military target. I analyzed your financial statements, tracked your client relationships, mapped your decision-making patterns. I identified your weaknesses and waited for the right moment to exploit them. Sarah was taking notes now, her HR instincts recognizing that this was information she would need for the transition. She was adapting, already shifting her loyalty from the losing side to the winning one. It was a survival skill that had served her well in corporate environments. I also spent those 18 months building Tech Vanguard Holdings into a legitimate business. We've secured contracts with 3 major tech companies, developed proprietary software solutions, and assembled a team of top-tier engineers and project managers. Many of them are veterans like me, people who understand the value of mission-focused leadership. Marcus's shoulders sagged as the full scope of his defeat became clear. He had not just lost his company, he had been outplayed by someone he had considered beneath his notice. The humiliation was complete and public, witnessed by the same employees who had watched him destroy my career. I stood again, this time moving to the window that overlooked downtown Seattle. The city sprawled out below us, a testament to innovation and reinvention. Companies rose and fell based on their ability to adapt, to recognize and cultivate talent rather than waste it. Marcus had failed that test spectacularly. There's one more thing, Marcus, I said without turning around. I want you to know that this wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. About proving that competence and integrity matter more than politics and prejudice. I turned back to face him, and for a moment our eyes met. In his gaze, I saw the beginning of understanding, the recognition that his actions had consequences beyond what he had imagined. He had destroyed my reputation because it was convenient, but in doing so, he had created an enemy far more dangerous than he could have anticipated. The security team is waiting outside, I said gently. They'll escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings. Your severance package is generous, more than you deserve, but appropriate for maintaining the company's reputation during the transition. Marcus stood slowly, his movements those of a man who had aged decades in a single morning. As he reached the door, he turned back one last time. I'm sorry, Jessica, I truly am. The apology hung in the air, neither accepted nor rejected. Sorry was a word that came too late, after damage had been done and consequences set in motion. But it was a start, an acknowledgement that his actions had been wrong. After Marcus left, escorted by 2 security guards who had once walked me out of this same building, the conference room felt different. The oppressive weight of his presence lifted, replaced by something lighter and more hopeful. Sarah and David remained, both clearly processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. What happens now? Sarah asked, her professional composure returning as she adapted to the new reality. I returned to my seat at the head of the table, the position I should have occupied years ago if merit had mattered more than bias. Now we rebuild. We create a company culture that actually lives up to its stated values. We hire and promote based on ability and character rather than politics and prejudice. David was studying the financial documents I had provided, his accountant's mind already working through the implications. These projections are ambitious but achievable. The BCZ Wallace. Cost savings from eliminating redundant management positions alone will improve our margins significantly. I nodded. Efficiency was never the problem with this company. The problem was leadership that prioritized ego over excellence. That changes today. The morning had become afternoon while we talked, and through the conference room windows I could see employees returning from lunch, unaware that their company had changed hands. Soon there would be an all-hands meeting, an announcement that would reshape their understanding of how corporate justice worked. But first, there was something I needed to do. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had memorized months ago. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. Henderson Logistics, this is Robert Henderson. Mr. Henderson, this is Jessica Martinez, the new CEO of Vanguard Solutions, formerly Wellington Tech Solutions. I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss. There was a pause, then a chuckle. Jessica Martinez, I heard rumors that you had left Wellington. I have to admit, I was disappointed. You were the most competent project manager I ever worked with. Thank you, sir. I'm calling to inform you that under new management, Vanguard Solutions would like to complete the project that was terminated 18 months ago. We believe we can deliver everything promised in the original contract, on time and under budget. Another pause, longer this time. That's a very interesting development. I assume this means Marcus Wellington is no longer in the picture? Mr. Wellington's employment was terminated this morning. I can guarantee that all future projects will be managed with the professionalism and attention to detail that Henderson Logistics deserves. In that case, Ms. Martinez, I think we should schedule a meeting. When can you be here? I looked at Sarah and David, both of whom were listening to my end of the conversation with obvious interest. They understood the significance of the Henderson contract, how its loss had been the catalyst for my termination and the beginning of the company's decline. How about Thursday morning? That should give me time to assemble a full project team and prepare a comprehensive presentation. Thursday it is. Jessica, I'm glad you landed on your feet. The way you were treated was unconscionable. After ending the call, I sat back and allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. The Henderson contract had been worth $3 million, enough to stabilize the company's finances and prove that competent management could succeed where ego-driven leadership had failed. Sarah broke the silence. How did you know he would take your call? I smiled at her. Because I maintained professional relationships even after I was terminated. Robert Henderson knew that my firing had nothing to do with my competence. He was waiting for an opportunity to work with me again, just not through Wellington Tech Solutions. The afternoon sun slanted through the conference room windows, casting long shadows across the table where my career had once been destroyed and was now reborn. In a few hours, I would address the entire company, explaining the transition and outlining a vision for the future that valued every employee's contribution. But for now, I sat in Marcus Wellington's former seat, surrounded by the remnants of his failed leadership, and planned the resurrection of a company that deserved better than it had received. The warrior who had been dismissed as broken was now the CEO who would rebuild what others had torn down. Sometimes justice comes like lightning, swift and dramatic. Sometimes it comes like sunrise, inevitable and transformative. Today, it had come like both, illuminating truths that had been hidden in shadow and changing everything in its wake. The girl who had once been called a liability had become the woman who held the future of 200 employees in her capable hands. And unlike the man who had preceded her, she understood that true leadership meant lifting others up, rather than tearing them down. The revolution was complete, but the real work was just beginning. 18 months earlier, I had walked out of Wellington Tech Solutions carrying a cardboard box and a termination letter that would haunt my dreams for weeks to come. The security guard who escorted me to the parking garage was apologetic, his weathered face creased with embarrassment as he performed a duty that clearly made him uncomfortable. Tony Ramirez was a fellow veteran, Army infantry from the Gulf War, and as we walked through the corridors lined with motivational posters about teamwork and excellence, he kept shaking his head. "This ain't right, Martinez," he whispered, glancing around to make sure no one could overhear. "What they're doing to you, it ain't right at all." The box in my arms contained 4 years of my professional life, a coffee mug from the Afghanistan Veterans Association, framed certificates of achievement that had once made me proud, family photos that had made my cubicle feel like home, and a small American flag that my grandfather had given me when I graduated from basic training. Such meager possessions to represent half a decade of dedication and sacrifice. My hands didn't shake as I loaded the box into my Honda Civic, though inside I felt like I was fragmenting into 1,000 pieces. The parking garage smelled of motor oil and concrete, industrial scents that reminded me of the motor pool at Fort Campbell, where I had learned to maintain Humvees under the Kentucky sun. Back then, I had believed that competence and dedication would always be rewarded, that the Army's meritocracy would translate seamlessly to civilian life. Tony lingered by my car, his security uniform crisp despite the emotional weight of the moment. "You got someplace to go?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "Someone to talk to?" I nodded, though the truth was more complicated. My apartment was paid through the end of the month, and I had savings that would last about 6 weeks if I was careful. Beyond that stretched uncertainty, a void that felt as vast and threatening as the Hindu Kush Mountains where I had once patrolled with my unit. But Tony didn't need to carry that burden. "I'll be fine," I told him, summoning the calm professionalism that had carried me through firefights and field hospitals. "Take care of yourself, Tony." As I drove through downtown Seattle that gray October afternoon, rain beginning to speckle my windshield, I felt the weight of Marcus Wellington's words pressing down on me like a physical force. The official termination letter cited, quote, "performance issues related to behavioral inconsistencies," but his verbal explanation had been far more brutal and personal. "You're unstable, Jessica," he had said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to making judgments about other people's worth. "The military broke you, and we can't have broken people in a professional environment. It's not fair to your colleagues to wonder when you might snap." The words had landed like mortar rounds, each syllable designed to destroy. I had spent 3 tours in Afghanistan, had led supply convoys through IED-infested roads, had treated wounded soldiers in field conditions that would give most civilians nightmares. But Marcus had reduced all of that experience to a single word: broken. Traffic crawled through the university district as students hurried between classes, their faces bright with the kind of optimism that comes from believing the world is fundamentally fair. I envied them their innocence, their faith that hard work and good intentions would be rewarded. At 32, I felt ancient compared to these kids who had never learned that sometimes the system failed you not despite your qualifications, but because of them. My apartment building was a converted warehouse in the Ballard neighborhood, all exposed brick and industrial fixtures that the landlord called urban chic and charged premium rent to achieve. I climbed 3 flights of stairs to my 1-bedroom unit, the cardboard box growing heavier with each step, and set it down on the kitchen counter that doubled as my dining table. The silence was oppressive. After 4 years of office chatter and conference calls, of keyboards clicking and phones ringing, the absence of human activity felt like sensory deprivation. I made coffee in my French press, a luxury I had allowed myself after my first promotion at Wellington Tech, and sat on my couch staring at the Space Needle visible through my living room window. The coffee tasted like disappointment. I opened my laptop and began the ritual that would define the next several weeks: job searching. The process was humiliating in ways I hadn't anticipated. Each application required explaining the gap in my employment, dancing around the circumstances of my termination without lying outright. I crafted cover letters that highlighted my military experience and technical skills, while carefully omitting any mention of PTSD or the real reason I was suddenly available. The responses, when they came at all, were polite rejections. "While your qualifications are impressive, we've decided to move forward with other candidates." The subtext was clear. Someone had made phone calls, had shared information that made me unemployable. Marcus Wellington's influence extended throughout Seattle's tech industry, and his version of events was being accepted as truth. Days blended into weeks. I established routines to maintain discipline, treating unemployment like a military assignment with specific objectives and timelines. Morning runs through Discovery Park, where the trails wound between old-growth trees and offered glimpses of Puget Sound. Afternoons spent at coffee shops, networking events, and informational interviews that led nowhere. Evenings dedicated to online courses and skill development, staying current with programming languages and project management methodologies. But beneath the structured facade, I was drowning. The nightmares that had been manageable during my time at Wellington Tech returned with a vengeance. I would wake at 3 a.m, heart pounding, sheets soaked with sweat, convinced I could hear incoming artillery that existed only in my traumatized memory. Sleep became elusive, and exhaustion made everything harder. Interviews went poorly, networking felt forced, confidence eroded with each passing day. My savings account dwindled with mathematical precision. Rent, utilities, groceries, gas, health insurance through Cobra, that cost more than my mortgage payment had in Kentucky. I started shopping at discount grocery stores, buying generic brands and calculating the cost per ounce of everything. Luxuries disappeared. No more coffee shop visits, no more dinners out, no more books purchased new when the library had perfectly good copies. The isolation was perhaps the most corrosive element. Military service had taught me the value of unit cohesion, of having people who would literally die for you and for whom you would do the same. Corporate life had provided a different but still meaningful form of community. Colleagues who shared professional goals and celebrated successes together. Without that structure, I felt unmoored, like a ship without anchor in a storm. I tried reaching out to other veterans through various organizations and meetup groups. The Afghanistan Veterans Association had monthly gatherings at a VFW hall in Georgetown, where men and women who had served in various capacities shared stories and supported each other through the challenges of reintegration. But even there, I felt like an outsider. Most of the other veterans had found stable employment or were successfully pursuing education benefits. My story of corporate termination felt like failure in a community that valued resilience and adaptation. Dr. Emily Rodriguez, my therapist at the VA Medical Center, encouraged me to view this period as an opportunity for growth rather than punishment. She was a clinical psychologist who specialized in PTSD treatment, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and an office decorated with paintings by veteran artists. Twice a week, I sat in her comfortable chair and tried to process the layers of trauma that my termination had exposed. What Marcus did to you was discriminatory and illegal, she would remind me during our sessions. His actions reflect his ignorance and bias, not any failing on your part. Intellectually, I understood the truth of her words, but emotional understanding was a different battlefield entirely. The voice in my head that whispered I was indeed broken, that I was damaged goods unsuitable for civilian employment, grew louder with each rejection letter and failed interview. December arrived early that year, bringing snow that transformed Seattle into a postcard version of itself. Christmas decorations appeared in shop windows, and the city hummed with holiday energy that felt foreign to my increasingly isolated existence. I had been unemployed for 2 months, and my savings had reached the point where I would soon need to make difficult decisions about rent and food. It was during this dark period that I received an unexpected phone call from Sarah Chen. She was calling from her personal number on a Saturday evening, her voice carefully neutral but carrying undertones of urgency. "Jessica, I hope you don't mind me reaching out," she began, and I could hear traffic noise in the background, suggesting she was calling from her car. "I wanted to let you know that there have been some developments at the company." My pulse quickened. Had Marcus changed his mind? Was there a possibility of reinstatement? But Sarah's next words crushed that hope before it could fully form. Robert Henderson from Henderson Logistics called Marcus this week. Apparently, their IT infrastructure has been having serious problems since we terminated the contract. He specifically asked about you, wanted to know if you might be available for consulting work. The Henderson contract had been my baby, a complex integration project that would have modernized their entire logistics operation. When Marcus fired me, he had also canceled the contract, claiming that my departure made completion impossible. The decision had cost Wellington Tech Solutions over $2 million in potential revenue, but Marcus had spun it as a necessary sacrifice to maintain quality standards. What did Marcus tell him, I asked, though I could guess the answer. Sarah's pause was telling. He said you were no longer with the company and that your departure was related to performance issues. Mr. Henderson was not pleased. He made it clear that he held you in high regard and questioned Marcus's judgment. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, Sarah carefully threading the needle between professional loyalty to her current employer and personal recognition that an injustice had been committed. She couldn't explicitly encourage me to contact Henderson directly, but she provided enough information for me to understand that the client relationship was strained and that my name had been mentioned favorably. After hanging up, I sat in my darkened apartment and considered the implications. Robert Henderson was a respected figure in the Seattle business community, someone whose opinion carried weight across multiple industries. If he was publicly questioning Marcus's decisions, it suggested that the narrative of my incompetence wasn't as firmly established as I had feared. I spent the weekend researching Henderson Logistics, studying their business model and recent expansion plans. They were a mid-sized company specializing in supply chain management for tech companies, exactly the kind of operation that needed sophisticated IT infrastructure to remain competitive. The contract that Marcus had canceled would have positioned them for significant growth, and its absence was clearly causing operational problems. Monday morning, I did something that 3 months earlier would have been unthinkable. I called Robert Henderson directly. His secretary was polite but protective, screening calls with the efficiency of someone who dealt with countless sales pitches and solicitations daily. But when I mentioned my name and my previous work on the Wellington Tech contract, her tone shifted immediately. "Mr. Henderson has been hoping to hear from you," she said, warmth entering her voice. "Can you hold for just a moment?" Robert Henderson came on the line with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for this call. "Jessica Martinez! I was beginning to think you had disappeared from the face of the earth. Where have you been hiding?" His tone was friendly, almost paternal, and I felt some of the tension I had been carrying for months begin to ease. "I've been exploring new opportunities," I said, which was technically true, if somewhat misleading. "Well, I hope one of those opportunities might involve helping us solve some problems that your former colleagues seem unable to address. Are you available for lunch this week?" We met at a seafood restaurant overlooking Elliott Bay, the kind of upscale establishment where business deals were made over fresh oysters and craft cocktails. Henderson was in his 60s, silver-haired and distinguished, with the bearing of someone who had built his company through decades of hard work and smart decisions. He listened intently as I explained my current status, his expression growing more troubled as I described the circumstances of my termination. "Marcus Wellington is an idiot," he said bluntly, cutting into his salmon with surgical precision. "I've dealt with him for 3 years, and while I respect his technical knowledge, his people skills are abysmal. The way he handled your departure was unprofessional and counterproductive." Over the course of 2 hours, Henderson outlined the problems his company had experienced since the Wellington Tech contract was canceled. Their existing IT infrastructure was struggling to handle increased data volume, causing delays and inefficiencies that were costing them clients. They had hired 2 different consulting firms to address the issues, but neither had produced satisfactory results. "What I need," Henderson said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone who had identified a solution to a persistent problem, "is someone who understands both the technical requirements and the business implications. Someone who can deliver results rather than excuses." The offer he made was generous, a 6-month consulting contract at a rate that would not only cover my immediate expenses, but allow me to rebuild my savings. More importantly, it represented validation that my skills and experience had value, that Marcus Wellington's assessment of my capabilities was wrong. I accepted the offer that afternoon. Working for Henderson Logistics felt like returning to life after a period of suspended animation. Their offices in the Georgetown district were modern but unpretentious, filled with people who treated technology as a tool rather than an end in itself. The challenge of rebuilding their IT infrastructure was exactly the kind of complex problem-solving that had attracted me to technology in the first place. The project required everything I had learned during my military service and my time at Wellington Tech Solutions. Like planning a military operation, it demanded careful analysis of objectives, resources, and potential obstacles. Each phase had to be executed with precision, because any failure could cascade through the entire system and jeopardize the company's operations. I assembled a small team of freelance developers and system administrators, many of them veterans, who brought military discipline to civilian projects. We worked long hours, but with a sense of purpose that had been missing from my final months at Wellington Tech. There were no office politics, no hidden agendas, just a clear mission and the autonomy to accomplish it effectively. The nightmares that had plagued me during unemployment began to recede. Having meaningful work, being valued for my contributions, provided a kind of therapy that no amount of counseling could match. Dr. Rodriguez noted the improvement during our sessions, observing that I was sleeping better and displaying fewer symptoms of anxiety and depression. Trauma often affects our sense of self-worth, she explained during one of our meetings. When that worth is validated through meaningful work and positive relationships, healing accelerates. As winter gave way to spring, the Henderson project progressed ahead of schedule and under budget. The new infrastructure we implemented increased their operational efficiency by 30%, while reducing costs by 15%. Robert Henderson was effusive in his praise, telling anyone who would listen that I was the most competent project manager he had ever worked with. Word spread through Seattle's tech community. Other companies began reaching out, offering consulting opportunities and full-time positions. My reputation, which Marcus had tried to destroy, was being rebuilt through competence and results, rather than politics and manipulation. But something had changed in me during those months of unemployment and recovery. The naive belief that merit alone would ensure success had been replaced by a harder, more strategic understanding of how power operated in corporate environments. I had learned that sometimes competence wasn't enough, that you needed to protect yourself from those who would exploit your dedication or weaponize your vulnerabilities. It was during this period of professional resurrection that I began to conceive the plan that would eventually lead to my acquisition of Wellington Tech Solutions. The idea started as a fantasy, a daydream about proving Marcus wrong in the most dramatic way possible. But as my consulting practice grew and my network expanded, the fantasy began to take on the structure of an actual strategy. I started paying attention to Wellington Tech's financial situation, monitoring their public filings and industry reports. The company was struggling, losing clients and bleeding talent, as Marcus's poor leadership created a toxic environment that drove away anyone with better options. The Henderson contract cancellation had been just the beginning of a series of strategic mistakes that were slowly strangling the company. My savings account, depleted during unemployment, began to grow again as consulting fees accumulated. But instead of spending the money on luxuries or even necessities I had foregone, I invested it carefully in a diversified portfolio that would provide the foundation for future opportunities. I also began studying corporate finance with the intensity I had once devoted to military tactics. Books on mergers and acquisitions, leveraged buyouts, and hostile takeovers filled my apartment. I attended seminars on business law and accounting, building knowledge that would prove essential for what I was planning. The turning point came during a chance encounter at an industry conference in Vancouver. I was representing Henderson Logistics, presenting a case study on infrastructure modernization, when I noticed Marcus Wellington in the audience. He looked older than I remembered, more tired, the stress of managing a failing company etched into the lines around his eyes. After my presentation, which had been well received by the audience, he approached me with what appeared to be genuine contrition. "Jessica," he said, extending his hand in a gesture that felt both formal and desperate. "That was an excellent presentation. You always were one of our most talented project managers." The audacity of this statement took my breath away. He was speaking as if my termination had been an amicable departure, as if he hadn't destroyed my reputation and livelihood with calculated malice. But I kept my expression neutral, professional, recognizing an opportunity to gather intelligence. "Thank you, Marcus. I've been fortunate to work on some challenging projects since leaving Wellington Tech." We talked for several minutes, and I learned more about the company's struggles than any public filing could have revealed. Client defections, talent hemorrhaging, missed deadlines, and cost overruns were creating a perfect storm that threatened the company's survival. Marcus was clearly desperate for solutions, hinting that he might be interested in bringing me back as a consultant. That conversation crystallized my understanding of Wellington Tech's vulnerability and Marcus's desperation. A failing company led by an incompetent executive, hemorrhaging money and reputation in equal measure. It was exactly the kind of target that private equity firms specialized in acquiring and restructuring. I began researching Wellington Tech's debt structure, identifying their primary lenders and understanding the terms of their financing agreements. Meridian Capital Group held the largest position, a term loan that had been used to finance the server infrastructure expansion that Marcus had championed as essential for growth. But the expansion had failed to generate expected revenue, leaving the company struggling to service its debt obligations. Over the following months, I cultivated relationships with key players in Seattle's financial community. Lawyers who specialized in corporate acquisitions, accountants who understood complex debt structures, investment advisors who could help structure financing for ambitious projects. I presented myself as a successful consultant exploring opportunities for expansion, which was technically true even if it omitted the specific nature of my expansion plans. The network I built during this period proved invaluable when I finally decided to move forward with acquiring Wellington Tech Solutions. These professionals provided the expertise I needed to navigate the complex legal and financial requirements of a corporate takeover, ensuring that every detail was handled correctly and legally. I also began building Tech Vanguard Holdings, the shell company that would eventually purchase Wellington Tech's debt. The process required establishing a legitimate business structure, obtaining proper licensing and insurance, and creating a track record of successful operations. I used my consulting practice as the foundation, gradually transitioning from independent contractor to CEO of a small but growing technology services company. The veterans I had worked with on various projects became the core team at Tech Vanguard Holdings. We shared not only technical expertise, but also the discipline and mission focus that military service had instilled in us. Unlike the corporate climbers and political operators who dominated many tech companies, my team was motivated by accomplishment rather than advancement, by solving problems rather than positioning for promotion. As Tech Vanguard Holdings grew, so did my understanding of Wellington Tech's increasing desperation. Through industry contacts and public information, I tracked their declining performance with the same attention to detail I had once devoted to enemy movements in Afghanistan. Each missed deadline, each lost client, each key employee departure brought them closer to the financial crisis that would create my opportunity. The final pieces of the plan came together during the late spring, almost exactly 1 year after my termination. Meridian Capital Group, facing pressure from their own investors over Wellington Tech's deteriorating performance, was quietly shopping the debt to potential buyers. The asking price was 75 cents on the dollar, representing a significant loss for Meridian, but an opportunity for anyone willing to take on the risk of a struggling company. I made the offer through intermediaries, presenting Tech Vanguard Holdings as a technology investment firm interested in acquiring undervalued assets in the Seattle market. The due diligence process was thorough but routine, focusing on the financial aspects of the transaction rather than the personal motivations of the buyer. Meridian's executives never knew that the woman whose career Marcus Wellington had destroyed was now positioning herself to acquire his company. The legal documentation was complex, involving multiple layers of corporate structure and financing arrangements. But my team of lawyers and accountants navigated the process with military precision, ensuring that every requirement was met and every contingency was covered. When the final papers were signed on a rainy Thursday morning in late June, Tech Vanguard Holdings owned Wellington Tech Solutions, debt, and had the legal authority to call it due immediately. I allowed myself one moment of satisfaction as I walked out of the law offices on 4th Avenue, carrying copies of the documents that gave me control over Marcus Wellington's professional fate. The woman he had dismissed as broken and unstable now held the power to determine whether his company survived or died. But this wasn't about revenge, despite how personal Marcus had made my termination. It was about justice, about proving that competence and integrity mattered more than politics and prejudice. It was about creating the kind of company that Wellington Tech Solutions should have been all along, one that valued talent regardless of its source, and treated employees with the respect they deserved. The final phase of the plan would require careful timing and flawless execution. I needed to position all the pieces before making my move, ensuring that when I finally revealed my hand, Marcus would have no options left except surrender. The warrior who had learned patience in the mountains of Afghanistan was about to teach a different kind of lesson in the boardrooms of Seattle. Summer passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. I continued building Tech Vanguard Holdings, reputation and capabilities, securing contracts that would provide stable revenue during the transition period. I also began reaching out to former Wellington Tech employees who had left the company in frustration with Marcus's leadership, building a talent pipeline for the post-acquisition period. Many of these conversations were conducted quietly, carefully, with the understanding that word of my plans could not reach Marcus before I was ready to act. But the response was overwhelmingly positive. Engineers and project managers who had watched my termination with shock and dismay were eager to work for a company that operated with integrity and competence. Robert Henderson became an unofficial advisor during this period, sharing his insights about corporate leadership and business strategy. He had built Henderson Logistics through decades of careful planning and execution, and his experience provided valuable perspective on the challenges of acquiring and restructuring a troubled company. "The hardest part isn't buying the company," he told me during one of our regular lunches. "The hardest part is rebuilding the culture after years of toxic leadership. People become cynical, defensive, afraid to take risks or show initiative. It takes time to restore trust." His words proved prophetic. As autumn arrived and Wellington Tech's financial situation continued to deteriorate, I began to hear stories from industry contacts about the company's internal dysfunction. Employees were leaving in increasing numbers, clients were demanding accountability for missed deadlines and cost overruns, and Marcus was reportedly becoming increasingly isolated and defensive. The moment I had been waiting for arrived in early October, almost exactly 1 year after my termination. Wellington Tech Solutions missed its third consecutive payment to Meridian Capital Group, triggering default provisions that allowed the debt holder to demand immediate repayment of the full principal amount. Since Tech Vanguard Holdings now owned that debt, I had the legal authority to force the company into bankruptcy or demand alternative arrangements. I chose a different path, one that would achieve my objectives while preserving the jobs of innocent employees who had never participated in my persecution. Instead of calling the loan immediately, I offered Wellington Tech Solutions a way out, immediate change in management structure, with Tech Vanguard Holdings taking operational control to ensure debt service and business recovery. The legal notice was delivered on a Monday morning, just as Marcus was arriving at his office with his usual coffee and newspaper. According to my sources inside the company, he spent most of that day in frantic phone calls with lawyers and accountants, trying to understand how his company had suddenly come under the control of an unknown investment firm. It took him 3 days to connect Tech Vanguard Holdings to my name, 3 days during which I was already implementing changes to improve the company's operations and client relationships. When he finally realized who was behind the acquisition, his response was swift and desperate, a request for an immediate meeting to discuss terms. I agreed to the meeting, but on my terms, in the conference room where my career had been destroyed 18 months earlier. The symmetry felt appropriate, a closing of the circle that had begun with my humiliation and would end with my vindication. As I prepared for that final confrontation, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. From the depths of unemployment and self-doubt to the heights of corporate acquisition and control, I had traveled a path that would have been impossible without the skills and resilience that military service had instilled in me. The woman who walked into Wellington Tech Solutions that Monday morning was not the same person who had been escorted out in shame 18 months earlier. She was harder, smarter, more strategic, but also more compassionate toward those who deserved protection. She understood that true leadership meant lifting others up rather than tearing them down, that strength came from building rather than destroying. Marcus Wellington was about to learn the difference between those two approaches to power. The lesson would be taught with the same precision and attention to detail that had characterized every phase of my plan, but it would also be tempered with the mercy that separates justice from revenge. The conference room was waiting, and with it the final act of a drama that had begun with a cardboard box and a termination letter, but would end with a corporate acquisition and a lesson in consequences that Marcus Wellington would never forget. The transformation of Wellington Tech Solutions began immediately after Marcus's departure, rippling through the company like water through cracked concrete. Within hours of his termination, word had spread through every department, carried by whispers in hallways and urgent text messages between colleagues who had witnessed the impossible. Their incompetent CEO had been outmaneuvered by the woman he had destroyed. I spent the remainder of that first day in individual meetings with department heads, each conversation carefully calibrated to address their specific concerns while establishing my authority as the new leader. The engineering team, led by a brilliant but demoralized woman named Patricia Vance, was particularly skeptical. They had watched too many promising initiatives die under Marcus's mismanagement to immediately trust another change in leadership. "With respect, Ms. Martinez," Patricia said during our meeting, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had fought too many losing battles, "we've heard promises about new direction before. What makes you different?" I understood her skepticism. Patricia had been with the company for 6 years, had watched Marcus promote less qualified men over her repeatedly, had seen her innovative projects canceled in favor of flashy initiatives that generated publicity but no revenue. She was exactly the kind of talented employee that companies like Wellington Tech couldn't afford to lose. "What makes me different," I replied, pulling out a detailed technical proposal she had submitted 8 months earlier, "is that I actually read your recommendations for improving our cloud infrastructure efficiency." Marcus rejected this proposal because he didn't understand the technical implications. "I'm implementing it starting next week." The change in her expression was immediate and profound. For the first time in our conversation, Patricia leaned forward, engagement replacing resignation. "You read the whole proposal? All 47 pages?" I nodded. "Including your appendix on cost-benefit analysis and the projected timeline for implementation. It's exactly the kind of forward-thinking strategy this company needs to remain competitive." Over the next 2 hours, Patricia and I discussed technical details that would have been incomprehensible to Marcus, exploring ways to modernize the company's infrastructure while maintaining operational stability. By the end of our meeting, she was volunteering to lead the implementation team, her enthusiasm restored by the simple act of being heard and valued. Similar conversations took place throughout the week as I met with every employee, from senior developers to administrative assistants. Each person had stories about Marcus's failures, about good ideas dismissed, and talented colleagues driven away by his toxic leadership style. But they also had ideas for improvement, suggestions that had been collecting dust in email folders because no one in leadership had bothered to listen. The accounts receivable department revealed that Marcus had been offering increasingly desperate discounts to retain clients, eroding profit margins without addressing the underlying quality issues that were driving customers away. The human resources team, led by Sarah Chen, admitted that they had received multiple complaints about discriminatory practices, but had been instructed by Marcus to minimize documentation to avoid legal liability. Most disturbing were the stories from employees who had tried to support me during my final months at the company. David Morrison, the young developer whose panic attack I had helped manage, revealed that he had been written up for unprofessional conduct after defending my actions to his supervisor. Sandra Williams, whose son's military injury I had helped her navigate, had been denied a promotion despite excellent performance reviews because Marcus considered her emotionally unstable by association. These revelations crystallized my understanding of how systematically Marcus had created a culture of fear and silence. My termination hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of using intimidation to maintain control. Employees had learned to keep their heads down, to avoid drawing attention that might result in retaliation. Changing that culture required more than policy adjustments. It demanded visible, consistent demonstration that competence and integrity would be rewarded, while discrimination and abuse would have consequences. I began by promoting Patricia Vance to Chief Technology Officer, a position that had been vacant since Marcus had eliminated it to reduce overhead costs. Her first day in the new role, she called an all-hands engineering meeting to outline the technical improvements we would be implementing. For the first time in years, she announced to a room full of developers and system administrators, "We're going to build things the right way instead of the fast way. We're going to have time to test our code, to document our systems, to create solutions that actually solve problems." The response was electric. Engineers who had been going through the motions suddenly had projects they cared about, deadlines that were realistic, and leadership that understood the difference between shipping features and shipping quality. Productivity increased measurably within weeks, not because people were working harder, but because they were working smarter under leadership that valued excellence over appearances. I also instituted weekly town hall meetings where any employee could raise concerns or suggest improvements without fear of retaliation. The first few sessions were tentative, with people testing whether this openness was genuine or another management trick. But as I responded to feedback with actual changes, trust began to develop. The financial turnaround was equally dramatic. Robert Henderson was true to his word, signing a new contract within 2 weeks of my takeover that brought in $8 million in immediate revenue. He also provided references to other logistics companies, opening doors that Marcus's reputation had closed. Within a month, we had secured 3 new clients and renegotiated terms with 2 existing ones who had been considering termination. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Several employees who had thrived under Marcus's political system found themselves marginalized in an environment that prioritized competence over connections. 2 middle managers who had built their careers on taking credit for others' work discovered that their actual contributions were insufficient to justify their positions. They resigned within 6 weeks, complaining about the unrealistic expectations of the new leadership. Their departures were celebrated quietly by the employees who had suffered under their incompetence. The cubicle culture that had once been poisoned by favoritism and backstabbing gradually gave way to something healthier, where collaboration was rewarded and individual achievement was recognized fairly. Sarah Chen proved particularly valuable during this transition period. Her experience in human resources, combined with her genuine remorse about her role in my termination, made her an effective advocate for cultural change. She worked tirelessly to revise company policies, ensuring that veterans and employees with mental health conditions were protected from discrimination. "I want to make sure this never happens again," she told me during one of our weekly meetings. "What we did to you was inexcusable, and I've learned from that mistake." The revised employee handbook included explicit protections for military veterans, clear procedures for accommodating PTSD and other service-related conditions, and robust whistleblower protections for employees who reported discrimination. Sarah also established partnerships with local veterans organizations, creating recruiting pipelines that brought military talent into the company. The first veteran we hired under the new policies was Miguel Santos, a former Navy communications specialist who had been struggling to find employment after leaving active duty. His technical skills were exceptional, but previous employers had been put off by his direct communication style and occasional difficulty with social cues related to his traumatic brain injury. Under Patricia's mentorship, Miguel flourished. His military discipline and attention to detail made him an ideal systems administrator, and his experience with secure communications protocols proved invaluable for our government contracting work. Within 3 months, he was leading a team of civilian developers who respected his expertise and adapted to his communication style. Miguel's success became a template for integrating other veterans into the company. We learned to recognize military skills that didn't translate obviously to civilian job descriptions, to value leadership experience that came from life and death situations rather than corporate boardrooms. The veterans we hired brought not just technical competence but a mission-focused mentality that elevated the performance of entire teams. The company's reputation in the industry began to recover as word spread about our improved performance and ethical leadership. Trade publications wrote articles about our turnaround, praising the innovative approaches to employee development and client service that we had implemented. Several industry leaders reached out to discuss potential partnerships and collaborations. The most satisfying endorsement came from Robert Henderson, who recommended us to the Seattle Chamber of Commerce for their annual Business Excellence Award. His nomination letter, which he shared with me, described our transformation as a masterclass in ethical leadership and operational excellence. But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from Tony Ramirez, the security guard who had escorted me out of the building 18 months earlier. He stopped by my office on a Thursday afternoon, his weathered face creased with the kind of smile that comes from witnessing justice served. "Ms. Martinez," he said, standing in my doorway with his security cap in his hands. "I wanted you to know how proud I am to work for this company again. For a while there, after what happened to you, I was thinking about finding another job. Didn't feel right, working for people who would treat a veteran that way. His words carried weight beyond their simple expression of support. Tony had served 3 tours in Vietnam, had returned to a country that didn't appreciate his service, had worked security jobs for 40 years, while watching corporate executives make decisions that prioritized profit over people. His approval meant more than any industry award or client testimonial. "You turned this place around," he continued, "made it into the kind of company that actually deserves the loyalty people give it. That takes real leadership." The changes we implemented attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Military recruiting officers began referring transitioning veterans to our company, confident that they would find an environment that understood and valued their experience. Mental health advocates cited our policies as examples of how employers could support workers with PTSD and other invisible disabilities. Most significantly, other companies began adopting similar approaches to veteran hiring and mental health accommodation. A consulting firm in Portland hired me to help them develop their own veteran integration program. A tech startup in San Francisco asked Patricia to speak at their conference about building inclusive engineering cultures. The ripple effects extended beyond the business world. Dr. Rodriguez, my therapist at the VA Medical Center, used my story in her research on post-traumatic growth, the psychological phenomenon where individuals emerge from trauma stronger and more capable than before. My experience became part of training programs for mental health professionals working with veterans. "What you've accomplished," she told me during one of our sessions, "demonstrates that trauma doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of a different, more meaningful narrative." The financial success that followed our cultural transformation exceeded all projections. By the end of our first year under new management, revenues had increased by 43%, while costs had decreased by 18%. The efficiency gains from having engaged, motivated employees were compounded by our improved reputation, which allowed us to charge premium rates for premium service. We expanded into new markets, leveraging our reputation for technical excellence and ethical leadership to secure contracts with government agencies and Fortune 500 companies. The veterans we had hired proved particularly valuable for defense and security work, where their clearances and specialized knowledge provided competitive advantages. The company that Marcus had nearly destroyed through incompetence and prejudice became a case study in successful organizational transformation. Business schools began including our turnaround in their curricula, using it to illustrate how leadership style affects every aspect of corporate performance. But the most important transformation was personal. The woman who had been dismissed as broken and unstable had proven that resilience could be transformed into strength, that trauma could become wisdom, that the very experiences that made her different also made her valuable. Standing in the conference room where my career had once been destroyed, now serving as my office as CEO of a thriving company, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The path from victim to victor had been neither straight nor easy, but it had been worth every struggle and setback. Marcus Wellington's attempt to destroy my reputation had inadvertently created the conditions for my greatest success. His prejudice and incompetence had forced me to develop skills and perspectives that made me a better leader than I ever could have become under his mentorship. The woman he had tried to break had become the executive who would redefine what leadership looked like in the 21st century. The company directory now listed Jessica Martinez as Chief Executive Officer of Vanguard Solutions. Below my name, in smaller text, was a line that would have been impossible to imagine 18 months earlier. Transforming organizations through ethical leadership and inclusive excellence. The warrior who had learned patience in the mountains of Afghanistan had taught a different kind of lesson in the boardrooms of Seattle. Sometimes justice comes not as punishment for the guilty, but as opportunity for the innocent to prove their worth. Sometimes the best revenge is not destruction, but reconstruction. Sometimes the most powerful victory is not defeating your enemies, but transforming yourself into someone they could never have imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.